Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we are in our part 2 of this, hopefully two-part series on how atheism is self-defeating inherently. And what we went over in part 1 was really laying a foundation. And then now here we will pick up where we left off in the next kind of sub-outline of what we're going to go through. So here, I'm going to try to demonstrate that atheism fails in its reasoning. So first, we'll look at reasoning requires the laws of logic. Second, we'll look at atheism cannot justify logic. And we'll listen to some atheist views and then have a conclusion. So reasoning requires the laws of logic. I think that we would all understand that. Logic uses inherent thinking methods, things that are natural to us. The law of non-contradiction is basic to logical thinking. And the law states that something cannot both be true and false at the same time in the same sense. It can't be 6 feet tall and 4 feet tall at the same time in the same sense. I can sit down and be 4 feet tall, but I can't be sitting and also be 6 feet tall while I'm 4 feet tall. So I think we understand that. Now everybody understands that. I'm claiming that what I believe or what I claim to be true is different than something else. That's pretty clear. The law of non-contradiction cannot be denied since it has to be used in order to deny it. In other words, to deny it is to affirm it by claiming that the law is not the same as what is opposite that law. In other words, if I say, well, this is true, if I say, look, non-contradiction, I don't think that's true. And that's not true for these reasons. What I'm doing is I'm actually using the law of non-contradiction, things that cannot be opposite and true at the same time. I'm saying something else is true that is not the same as the law that I'm stating. So you're using the law when you try to deny it. So non-contradiction is based on the absolute nature of truth. Things have to be true in order for us to actually understand what we're dealing with. So truth obviously is absolute, and to try to say that it's not is an absolute truth claim. You end up in the same cycle. You're affirming what you're trying to deny. To say the truth is not absolute, to make that statement is an absolute truth claim. And so anytime you have a situation like that, you just turn the claim on itself to see whether the claim that is made can support its own principle. And that will pretty quickly dismantle any argument that's not based in truth and logic. So truth is narrow and excludes its opposite, which is expressed in the law of non-contradiction. And truth is always narrow. 2 and 2 is always going to be 4. It's not going to be any other number that exists, which is as high as you want to count. And it always excludes its opposite. And that's for people that are making claims even opposite to what I would believe. They're saying that what they believe is true and that is also excluding its opposite, which could be my position. So this works for everybody the same. It's not something that just theists use, atheists use it too, and everybody in between. So the point is that using logic and reason, this is required in order to use these inherent thinking methods like we all think. And the problem is that logic is a non-material aspect of our being. And atheism just cannot justify the existence of logic. Atheism denies anything beyond the material world. Atheism denies the supernatural world, but wants to utilize logic, which requires God's existence. In other words, atheists want to use a theistic worldview to argue for an atheist worldview. They don't say that's what they're doing, but it requires, to use logic requires a theistic worldview to argue against it. This is a self-defeating position. In other words, there's really no justification for logic. Logic is not a material aspect of nature, right? There is no logic molecules in our brain, and if God doesn't exist, logic doesn't exist, and atheists are not actually arguing a point. Because if God doesn't exist, they're only reacting to what their material brains are telling them, if they're telling them anything at all, but who knows, because they're just chemical reactions that are going on that have developed over the years, and you can call that thinking, but that's not thinking. So logic has no justification in an atheistic worldview because it transcends the material world. Now, let's look at some atheists' views on some things that are obviously a contention point between atheists and theists. So atheists famously use logic, though it doesn't exist in their worldview, to express belief in views that can only exist in a theistic universe. Absolutes do not exist in the atheist worldview, since there is no place for them to be grounded. You have to have a place of grounding. In an atheist worldview, there are no absolutes. It's just what their opinions are and their preferences. Absolutes only exist in a theistic universe, since God is the transcendent being that is the grounding of reality. So in a theistic world, we can have these non-material aspects, logic, reasoning, thinking, and we'll get into some of the others with consciousness and all. But these are all non-material aspects, and they have to have grounding somewhere beyond man, because they have to have their place in ultimate reality, because we do not make ultimate reality. Ultimate reality has to have its grounding somewhere. Otherwise, nothing really means anything at all, because there's no place to ground truth or absolutes. Truth is absolute, therefore morality is absolute. And again, morality will get its grounding in God. He is the ultimate reality, therefore truth, and morality is grounded in his nature. That's where it comes from, and then is imposed upon us, his creation. Otherwise, again, none of it is real, and I'll get to the place where I believe that I can demonstrate that even from the standpoint of arguing a point, an atheist is actually proving God's existence. Atheists argue about logic, morality, and other non-material aspects epistemologically and ignore the ontological necessity of why they exist in the first place. So just because we know how to use logic, in other words, we can think logically, we can reason, we can talk about morality. I have a sense no different than an atheist of things that are right and wrong. Just because I know that and I can have this innate sense of understanding of it, that doesn't tell me where it comes from. Now, it obviously does not come from material sources, because material does not give rise to non-material aspects. But let's hear Richard Dawkins and see how he responds to a question, which I think is a good one, on morality.
Our next question comes from in the audience. It's from Hamza Qureshi.
My question is for Professor Dawkins. Considering that atheism cannot possibly have any sense of absolute morality, would it not then be an irrational leap of faith, which atheists themselves so harshly condemn, for an atheist to decide between right and wrong?
Absolute morality, the absolute morality that a religious person might profess would include what? Stoning people for adultery, death for apostasy, punishment for breaking the Sabbath. These are all things which are religiously based absolute moralities. I don't think I want an absolute morality. I think I want a morality that is thought out, reasoned, argued, discussed, and based upon, I could almost say, intelligent design. Can we not design our society which has the sort of morality, the sort of society that we want to live in? If you actually look at the moralities that are accepted among modern people, among 21st century people, we don't believe in slavery anymore, we believe in equality of women, we believe in being gentle, we believe in being kind to animals. These are all things which are entirely recent. They have very little basis in biblical or Quranic scripture. They are things that have developed over historical time through a consensus of reasoning, sober discussion, argument, legal theory, political and moral philosophy. These do not come from religion. To the extent that you can find the good bits in religious scriptures, you have to cherry pick. You search your way through the Bible or the Quran and you find the occasional verse that is an acceptable profession of morality. And you say, look at that, that's religion. And you leave out all the horrible bits. And you say, oh, we don't believe that anymore, we've grown out of that. Well, of course we've grown out of it. We've grown out of it because of secular moral philosophy and rational discussion.
Tony Burke.
Now, we'll get into kind of analyzing what Richard Dawkins says in a moment here, but Dawkins is actually talking about sociology and what people do, not morality and what they ought to do. And he is wrong about his view on the Bible, but that's beyond kind of the purview of what we're doing here. So Dawkins doesn't or can't answer the question that's asked because there is no answer in an atheist world. He never actually answered the question. He went off onto other things. He never answers the question since atheism has no real answer to absolutes. In other words, there is no right or wrong. What Dawkins does say is that there are religious moralities he doesn't like, therefore, if they are absolute examples, they should be rejected. So it's his preference, but he doesn't answer the question. Dawkins makes the claim that morality should be reasoned, argued, or discussed no different than preferences are. Sure, you can talk about moralities and argue about them and anything else, but I don't feel the obligation to follow anybody's preferences but my own if that's all they are. However, morality doesn't exist. If God doesn't exist, there is no place to ground it. So Dawkins is basically saying everybody's going to have their own idea. We'll just kind of talk about everybody's idea, and whosever idea we like, those are the ones that we'll use, and then we'll call that morality. Reason doesn't exist if God doesn't exist. So he wants a morality that's reasoned out. Well, morality doesn't actually exist because morality is something imposed from outside of us and has an obligation to it. And reason doesn't exist if God doesn't exist because reasoning is transcending the molecules in our brain. Molecular reaction is not thinking and eliminates any reason. That's not how you reason, through mere random chemical reaction. Are we to suppose that morality and truth is based on vote and social situations? Because that's really all that's left when you just get everybody together and say, okay, what would you like to have for morality? This would be an arbitrary preference and therefore non-binding on anyone, other than what would be made by laws, but ultimately it wouldn't be right or wrong. It's just what you have to do because so many people said that this is what has to be done. So it's not actually dealing with morality, it's dealing with the imposition of power on people because they choose and have the ability to exercise it, whether it's by majority or just by somebody that is in power. We know how that goes. So let's hear from Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, because they think evil is the main problem when we deal with the existence of God. So let's see what they have to say about it.
On this, if you understand that God is supposed to be good and supposed to be all-powerful, then the problem with evil really looms. And evil is everywhere, and it's not just evil so that we can be heroes and triumph over evil. That makes a good story, and it makes our lives more exciting and all that. But what about the extraordinary brutality that we discover in the animal world when we find insects that sort of hypnotize their prey and then burrow inside and lay their eggs, and then the eggs eat them out from the inside while they're still alive. There's all sorts of gruesome tales of this sort that we could tell about things that, as we're animals, do to each other. And why would a good God allow such horrible things to go on? I think that evil is, you can't explain it away.
God from all this evil. Okay, we're told that God is loving and kind and just and intrinsically good. But when someone like myself points out the rather obvious and compelling evidence that God is cruel and unjust because he visits suffering on innocent people of a scope and scale that would embarrass the most ambitious psychopath,
So we see that Dawkins and Dennett and Harris have a very strong opinion that evil somehow is a reason to deny God's existence, because if God exists, then he would not allow this evil to continue, and the mere fact that evil continues, then that means that God is really the one that's promoting it, and so that would be an evil God. So Dennett and Harris see evil as a main reason for their atheism, but then charge God with immoral behavior. That's an interesting thing to do. At a minimum, their arguments fail, since evil can't be known unless good exists, and God is required for good to exist. You can't know what's evil unless you know what's good. Evil is a privation or corruption of good. We know that because we know what things are before the evil, according to the law of non-contradiction, actually comes in. In other words, like rust to the car. We know the car is good without rust, so rust is evil in relation to the car, like cancer is to the body. Now, you can remove the evil, you can remove the rust, you can remove the cancer, you can remove the bad from something good, but you can't remove the good. In other words, you can't remove the car, you'd have no rust, the body, you'd have no cancer. So evil does not exist in and of itself as a thing that was created. Evil has to attach itself to something that is good, and we know that because we see something that's good, just like Dennett and Harris believe that they do, and then they say, well, this is evil because it should be like this, but it's like this. So they're using the law of non-contradiction, they're reasoning through it, and then what they do is they say, this is evil because I know what good is. Well, how do they know what good is? Dennett, he determines animal behaviors are evil because he doesn't like them. That's his preference. But he can't justify it as wrong or evil without God. In other words, I would ask it this way. How does Dennett know that what he thinks is the brutality of animals and bugs is not good? In other words, what objective standard does he use, right? Maybe it is good for survival that the bugs are cruel to each other. Maybe the only way that they can survive is to trap their prey and eat them from the inside out or whatever. It is pure subjective opinion that he offers. Unless you have an objective reference to go against, you can, because people do it all the time, but you cannot justify your claim as being good, bad, or other, because without a reference point, it's like floating in space. There's no place to ground yourself. You don't know whether you're upside down, sideways, or back and forth, because there's no point of reference when you're just floating out there in space. And, it's not possible for them to make the determination of what is good and bad if they have no objective reference point. They are not the reference for good and evil, because the next person would be a different reference, and on till almost 8 billion people. There's no meaning to that at all. That's all a bunch of people's opinions. And to call it evil, good, morality, or anything else is really an abuse of what the definitions are and the understanding of what we already know. How about C.S. Lewis on evil? What does he have to say? He said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? So that's from Mere Christianity. And again, you have to have a reference point. And that reference point has to be something that's absolute, because if it moves, it's not a reference anymore. So before Dawkins, Harris, Dennett, or any other atheist argues a moral point, they need God to exist in the universe he created to make their claim. In an atheistic universe, life will never come from non-life. In other words, rocks don't become people no matter how much time that you give them. If I held a rock in this hand and a person in this hand and said, just give me enough time and the rock will become a person, you'd think that was nonsense. Well, that's what we're talking about here. This is based on what we know currently, not what we want to know or hope will occur. In other words, we're reasoning based on evidence that exists, not what we hope will exist. And this is the classic failure of atheists. When they don't have an answer to something, they use what I call the natural God of the natural gaps, or the natural gaps argument for materialism, because they accuse theists of using the God of the gaps, which we are not, because we're arguing from what we know, right, and the effects of what we know back to a cause. And that argument is based on reason and knowledge, right? But atheists are arguing based on what they want to know and hope to discover in the future. We're getting into some faith there, and they don't like that word. So morality cannot be grounded in every single individual on the planet. Those are opinions. Opinions have no authority or obligation to them. They're simply preferences. Morals carry an obligation to them because they are not just opinions. That's why the word is different, and that's why everybody has the sense of morality, and they have strong opinions about what is moral and not moral, what is good and evil. However, their opinions are views, but the morality that they are arguing about becomes absolute. We need to understand that. Let's hear from Nicholas Humphrey and Daniel Dennett on the subject of consciousness. This is interesting.
Called the thick moment of sensation, and that's consciousness.
It seems like something so different than everything else we know in the physical world.
Well, exactly so. Sensations are possibly the most mysterious thing which exists in our universe. Our experience of sensation seems to have qualities which material matter couldn't give rise to, and that's where the mystery lies. Sometimes I say that consciousness is an illusion, and the reason for saying that is that it seems to us that it exists outside of time and space and matter as defined by physics. It can't be so. I'm a materialist. This is being produced by my brain or your brain. And so I believe that in the end, the explanation must come down to what's going on inside our heads. But consciousness doesn't seem to have those qualities because it makes us think of ourselves as being something outside matter, of having a metaphysical significance, perhaps, which sets us above and outside the mundane world.
But this is an illusion.
I hope it's an illusion, I should say, because as a scientist, I want to believe that we can explain it in terms of physics and chemistry, the matter of the brain. If that's not an illusion, then we're dealing with something paranormal. But my belief, of course, is there's nothing paranormal about consciousness. We're not going to have to invoke new laws of physics or new laws of psychic phenomena to explain it. In the end, we must be able to bring this all back to earth with an explanation in terms of the chemistry and physics of the brain. The brain has set us up to experience these phenomena in the way a magician can set up a mystery show on stage to impress us with the strangeness of the phenomena which he's demonstrating. In this case, it's our own brain which is impressing us with what's going on in our heads in a way which makes us feel special and transcendent. That's what the point of consciousness is, and in the end, why it evolved.
Seriously, they won't take seriously. They won't take seriously the idea that consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain. And they say, oh, I just can't imagine it. And I say, no, you won't imagine it. You can imagine it, you're just not trying.
Okay, now I actually had a second example, which is why it says example 3 up above, but I needed to cut that out. It was copyrighted. But as you can see, they have their opinions of what consciousness is. And, you know, they think it's playing tricks on the brain, that it's an illusion, that our brains think that it's more than our brains, but it's not, because it can't be more than our brains, because if it was, then that would mean there was something beyond our biology, and we know that that doesn't exist. And you see how they're pigeonholing themselves, and this is not a scientific way to view things. If consciousness is an illusion and plays tricks on the mind, the conclusions of Humphrey and Dennett are all self-defeating claims. I hope you can see that. To claim consciousness creates any form of deception upon the brain is a self-defeating claim, since it is the brain, in other words, it's the brain itself, according to these experts, that's deceived by the trick. So the one that's being deceived, the brain, is the one that's evaluating that it's being deceived. Well, how does it know that? I mean, you need to be outside and beyond it in order to know that there's a deception going on. This is problematic since they claim the brain is evaluating the consciousness it is said to be deceived by. How does the brain know it's deceived and what the deception is? If the brain is being deceived, how does it know it's being deceived? It has no reference point beyond itself. This is the whole problem with their viewpoints. Not to mention, Humphrey talks about what he hopes and expects and, has faith somehow that it'll just work out like that because of what he believes and takes basically on blind faith. It is one thing to speculate what consciousness is. It's another to claim you know what it is. As you explain, it is deceptive and creates an illusion that tricks the brain. What? How do you get that? So it's not that I just speculate on what consciousness is. I know what it is. Even though it's deceiving me, I know it's deceiving me. This is kind of crazy stuff. If consciousness is a magic trick or an illusion, one would have to know the magic trick or be outside the illusion to know they were being tricked or deceived. But they are not. These people are not outside of it. They are in it. Consciousness is sensed as something more than biology because it is something more than biology. Everybody has that sense, but yet at the same time they say, no. This is like Dawkins and Crick telling us that, look, when you use your senses and you look at biology, it's all going to have an appearance like it's designed, but it's not designed. I'm telling you, it's not designed. So keep saying to yourself, it's not designed, it's not designed. But yet, that's what these guys are saying. They're saying, look, everybody has this sense that consciousness is more than your brain, but it's not. It's not. Well, how do you know that? Well, because it can't be. It can't be because of my worldview. That is very limited and unscientific as far as I'm concerned. Why should I ignore my senses that my consciousness is more than my brain because atheists tell me to? Why would I do that? Then that means I have to go to them to answer all my questions because I don't have the senses that I can trust in my own person to do that. So I have to trust the senses that they have that I don't even know what their senses are. And their own consciousness tells them the same thing. So they're denying their own consciousness, and they want to deny my consciousness its own view on the fact that it's different than what they say. Consciousness exercises the thinking methods that result in its own evaluation. In other words, I'm using my consciousness and its thinking ability to figure itself out. Therefore, it is real, or the thinking itself can't be real. In other words, consciousness has to be beyond my physical brain. Otherwise, I can't trust it in what it's in what it is or what it's doing. This is something the great mind of our Creator has created in all of us, which is why the sense is everywhere. The Creator of the universe has put this in us. The great mind. He is the ultimate reality, and matter comes from mind, not the other way around. Deciding ahead of time that consciousness can only be biology because it fits a naturalistic worldview is unscientific speculation at best, at worst the denial of reality. Ignoring evidence by our senses has no place in the scientific endeavor of discovery and learning and is completely irrational. Excuse me. Consciousness is not discoverable by science, since it is man's consciousness that gave rise to science itself and is required to do science. I mean, think about that. Science presupposes man has a consciousness and is able to think and reason using logical principles to do science. And that statement, and even doing science, like reasoning it out ahead of time, plotting it, planning it, thinking about it, none of that is scientific. It can't be examined scientifically. You can't put it under a microscope because they are non-material aspects of our being. Let's hear Daniel Dennett on the subject of free will. And like I say here, it doesn't get any better.
For billions of years on this planet, there was life but no free will. Physics hasn't changed, but now we have free will. The difference is not in physics, has nothing to do with determinism or indeterminism. It has to do with, ultimately, with biology, particularly evolutionary biology. What has happened over those billions of years is that greater and greater competences have been designed and have evolved. And the competence of a dolphin or of a chimpanzee, the cognitive competence, the sort of mental competence, is hugely superior to the competence of, a lobster or a starfish. But ours dwarfs the competence of a dolphin or a chimpanzee, perhaps even greater extent. And there's an entirely naturalistic story to tell about how we came to have that competence or those competences. And it's that can-do, it's that power that we have, which is natural, but it's that power which sets us aside from every other species. And the key to it is that we don't just act for reasons, we represent our reasons to ourselves and to others.
So Dennett believes we represent our reasons to ourselves and others. We don't just act on them. Well, Dennett makes the same self-defeating conclusions on free will that he did on consciousness. Is he conscious of that? I don't know. If free will is only biology, it is molecules in random motion and not free at all. This is where atheists get into, and I know they even disagree with each other, but they get into this place where they say we have no free will because they realize that if all we are is molecules in motion, then there's really no freedom of that. It's just going to take on some pattern or whatever, and that's just what we're thinking and what we're doing. Now, based on what we know of biology, it seems that only Richard Dawkins is being consistent in his statements, okay? Now, Dawkins says we're dancing to our DNA, and this is what it says in River Out of Eden, a Darwinian view of life. He says DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. In other words, I do the things I do because it's in my DNA. I can't change that. I can't help that. That's just who I am. Which means that, what Daniel Dennett is saying, we represent our reasons to ourselves and others. I don't even know what that means. I represent my reason to myself, and somehow that is freedom from within the context of biology and billions of years of development and what he calls even design. I mean, there's no intelligence in the evolutionary development of anything. There's no intelligence added in, but they add it in all the time because they know that things do not just evolve randomly and end up at the place that we're at today with all the reason, logic, and discussions and the freedom of discussing what they want to, by the way, and the choices that they make. People are only reacting to their own chemical makeup, and talk of responsibility, in other words, if there is nothing transcendent to ourselves or others, is really defining a preference to exercise my own free will that is more than biology. It is my want to do. So, look, if I say I want to do that and then I do that, then I obviously had the freedom to make that decision. You can argue that that's in my DNA, but I can change my decision. Does that mean my DNA changes? These are a reasoning, they are using a reasoning process as opposed to looking at the evidence and working from the evidence. They are concluding first and then backing up to try to find evidence or explanations that they feel will work for their worldview. That's not scientific, that's not intelligent, and that is really a broken thinking process to begin with. Atheists can't have it both ways, free will and no free will, in that discussion, though neither free will nor consciousness exist in an atheistic universe because, again, they would be transcendent of biology. If free will is only biology, it isn't free, but the mere reaction of chemical biology, since nothing transcendent exists for it to have as a source. If free will is not, if it's only biology, number one, if it is more than biology, it is not the result of natural law or materialism, and we are now in the theistic universe atheists fear. In other words, if it's more than biology, it has to be transcendent. Biology isn't going to create it. All atheists talk of free will, consciousness, and other non-material human thinking ability is epistemological, in other words, just because they can do it, and avoids the ontological implications entirely, which is unscientific to avoid them. But the ontological implication is that it is given to us and it is transcendent because there is a transcendent being outside of time and space that has given that to us. All this thinking on thinking requires a theistic universe in the first place. Thus, atheists defeat their own position by using their thinking and reasoning ability to defend atheism. The mere fact that they're using all these capabilities that will not exist in an atheistic universe is proving theism. This self-defeating position does not go unnoticed. Even the atheist Thomas Nagel had some interesting things to say about it. And here's his quote. Nagel said, "It seems natural to think that the physical sciences can, in principle, provide the basis for an explanation of the mental aspects of reality as well, that physics can aspire finally to be a theory of everything." In other words, everything would come from biology. However, I believe this possibility is ruled out by the conditions that have defined the physical sciences from the beginning. The physical sciences can describe organisms like ourselves as part of the objective spatio-temporal order, our structure and behavior in space and time, but they cannot describe the subjective experiences of such organisms or how the world appears to their different particular points of view. Going on with the quote, there can be a purely physical description of the neurophysiological processes that give rise to an experience, and also of the physical behavior that is typically associated with it. But such a description, however complete, will leave out the subjective essence of the experience. How is it from the point of view of its subject, without which it would not be a conscious experience at all? So the physical senses, he goes on, in spite of their extraordinary success in their own domain, necessarily leave an important aspect of nature unexplained. Further, since the mental arises through the development of animal organisms, the nature of those organisms cannot be fully understood through the physical sciences alone. This means that the scientific outlook, if it aspires to a more complete understanding of nature, must expand to include theories capable of explaining the appearance in the universe of mental phenomena and the subjective points of view in which they occur, theories of a different type from any we have seen so far." End of quote. Now, this is my response, my own personal one. I appreciate Thomas Nagel's honesty and approach as an atheist on the subject. He realizes that attempts to use what we know of the physical sciences and chemistry will not discover the mental processes of consciousness and subjective thinking he describes. Though as an atheist and materialist, he believes that someday the sciences will discover a new way to investigate this apparently non-material aspect of human development, I think he will be unhappy with the result. His blind faith in any further discovery is based on what he wants to know, not what he does know. This is blind faith since it has no evidence. Nature can never create nature, and aside from the materialists' miracle of rocks turning into people over time, their blind faith that someday science will have an answer is willful self-deception, since they don't reason from what they know to be true, but from what they want to be true. That's my opinion on it. And here's C.S. Lewis's opinion on thinking. He said, supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But, if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. And he really hits the nail on the head. There's no better way to say it, which is why I love that quote. So here are some concluding thoughts. Atheists can only argue against God because God exists and they enjoy the thinking ability he created in them and his universe. They're like the college student that demonstrates on an American campus to promote communism and advertise its benefits. What the student doesn't realize is the freedom to demonstrate, attend college, and voice a dissenting opinion to a communist government would not be allowed under a communist government. Similarly, atheists use all the inherent human thinking and reasoning abilities from the theistic God to make a case against him. They are in self-contradiction before they promote their first argument by their own reasoning process and don't even realize it or don't want to. Atheists can only think because God exists. Everyone has inherent thinking abilities that are self-evident. The law of identity, I know you're not you, you know I'm not me, I can identify certain things and know that they are those things and not other things. The law of non-contradiction, which we've gone over time and time again, and the law of excluded middle, that things aren't halfway, they either are or are not when talking about these absolute things. So these self-evident abilities exist and are used to develop arguments against God and for atheism. However, these abilities only exist in man's capacity to think and reason because God exists. Thus, like the law of non-contradiction, it is affirmed when it is used to claim non-contradiction doesn't exist. And these inherent thinking methods are used to defend and promote atheism when in fact they wouldn't exist without God. They're doing the same thing. They're affirming theism by just reasoning and promoting their arguments against theism and for atheism. Bottom line, atheists trust their thoughts and believe they use logic and reason to bring forth truth. I mean, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't be arguing it. However, materialism makes truth, reason, and logic impossible since non-material aspects are not possible in an atheistic framework, nor could truth be trusted, not in just molecules in motion. Atheists claim that since these abilities exist, it must have been the result of biological evolution. However, there is no evidence that material ever gave rise to non-material aspects such as thinking and reasoning. We need to argue from what we know, not from what we want to know. Evolution does not solve the problem for atheists because they would be claiming it has miraculous capabilities. However, the abilities ascribed to evolution, abiogenesis, right, life from non-life, development of new body plans that break the genome barrier, reasoning from no thinking ability, no transitional forms in the fossil record, you can go on and on and on, are unknown based on the law of causality, nor has science come up with evidence beyond speculative blind faith claims of hope to one day discover them. Because they don't exist, atheists say, well, we hope, no, we'll keep going. Eventually we'll figure it out. No, I think we'll find an answer to that. That's great. But you know what? If you want to be scientific, you have to argue from what you know, not from what you don't know. And you have to always work effect to cause. If you want to discover the cause, you have to deal with the current effects, not what you hope will be the effects or what you hope eventually will be a different cause for what you know can only be the cause for the current effects. Atheists believe their moral and aesthetic value judgments are meaningful and significant. However, in a materialistic universe, these are not possible. The epistemological understanding of them does not account for their ontological existence. Talk of varied imaginative ways it could happen is not science. So, you can talk about all this stuff, but ontologically, if you have no means of even having a potential explanation based on what we know, then it's all just blind faith and speculation. The thinking and reasoning ability of atheists can be very profound and elaborate. These people, many of them are brilliant. However, we know that the accidental collisions of atoms in the brain, molecules in random motion, even if mental patterns develop from heredity in physics, is not actual thinking, reasoning, and consciousness. They're just patterns that develop, but they're nothing more than that. Atheism is inherently self-defeating because when they use their consciousness, thinking ability, imagination, reasoning, and logic to argue against God, they give the strongest evidence for God's existence, since he must exist for those principles to be at work in their abilities. They affirm transcendence when they try to argue against it. Again, just nothing but self-defeating positions. What we are saying is that matter cannot give rise to mind, but mind gives rise to matter. In other words, in my own capability, reasoning from effect to cause, my ability to think, reason, experience guilt, consciousness, and consciousness can only be explained by reasoning back to my mind, their source, which is also a non-material aspect of what I am as a human being. So, I only have the ability that I have, and if I'm going to, reason from effect to cause, the effects of thinking, reasoning, this conscious and everything, obviously gets back to their source, which is my mind or my consciousness. If I reason my way back to my own mind based on the law of causality and reasoning effect to cause, the mind I possess is reasonable evidence to a greater mind, the one that created all time, space, and matter. In other words, I have a mind, but I didn't get one and you didn't get one because they just happen to evolve and have this miracle in evolution that produces a mind from a material process. Obviously, there is a great mind behind it. There has to be an ultimate mind beyond mind. So in the blue here, ultimately all effects work back to a cause, and that cause cannot be nature, since nature had a beginning. Nature cannot be the cause of nature. Thus, the ultimate place that reality is grounded is the spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, purposeful, intelligent, personal, moral being, the creator of the universe. This is the great mind that began all things but had no beginning himself. This is the God of the Bible. The Bible is clear on these principles that we're stating. David said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." Psalm 19, 1-4. This is only true if man has the ability, as David did, to observe, reason, and recognize God's creative works, for God is known by his acts, not directly. In other words, reasoning effect back to cause. Paul said of this observable evidence that David was talking about, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes," in other words, God's, "are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead," talking about his intelligence, "so that they are without excuse," people that deny them, Romans 1:20. This adds man's accountability to the natural observation and discovery of God's existence by his creation, reasoning effect to cause. We reason our way back to God with the senses he's given us. So, Paul is pretty clear here. And, this is so basic. Look, you can deny it all you want if you are an atheist, but you will be without excuse when you do stand before God. Knowing that God placed the conscience in man, Paul declares it is a law or principle that all people innately possess, and this also adds man's accountability to God. He says, "For when Gentiles who do not have the law," in other words, the law of Moses, "by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. Romans 2:14-15. Now, we can't control our conscience, but the moral law written on our hearts dictates to our conscience, imposing guilt. That's the accuses that he mentions there, or acceptable behavior, which he calls excusing. In other words, it's acceptable behavior. My conscience excuses it. I do not feel guilt. Okay, now everybody feels guilt. This is universal. This is undeniable. This non-material aspect of our being is not possible in an atheistic universe. Evolution does not have the ability to develop moral laws that transcend biology and by guilt move humans to take actions against the natural survival instincts that Darwinian evolution is founded upon. Moreover, much of man's behaviors in this context are based on non-material value judgments, not biology. So what I'm trying to say is that atheists argue all the time that all these things occur because they are, somehow, even though they don't know how, but they come up with the reasoning process in order for it to make sense to them that we do certain things to survive, because survival of the fittest is natural in the Darwinian model, and so all these things are being done for the species to survive. And what I'm saying is there are many actions that people take that are against their survival instincts, but they take them because they have a value judgment of love or concern for somebody else, and they will sacrifice themselves or do whatever they need to, contrary to the Darwinian model, and this happens all the time. And people are motivated to do things beyond survival all the time, okay? So, and some people do very destructive things to themselves all the time, again, against the Darwinian model of survival. So, you can't have it just the way you want it when you want to have it the way that it'll make sense just for that moment. Only the Bible reveals the theistic God that created the universe and all life contained in it, right? In the beginning, time, God created the heavens, space, and the earth. There's matter. So there's the beginning of time, space, and matter in Genesis 1:1. Thus, the time-space continuum was created by God, requiring that he is not part of that creation or contingent to it, right? God didn't need the creation to exist. He existed before he created everything, right, in the time-space continuum. So the biblical God is unique in how he communicated his message via the words his prophets and apostles wrote, and confirmed those words through the miracles he worked through them. So this is very unique to the Bible. There is nothing parallel to it or even close to it in history. The apostles John and Paul declared Jesus Christ, God the Son, is the agent of creation. John says all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. John 1:3. And Paul says, for by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible. Colossians 1:16. So thus the Bible unashamedly claims that God created all that exists, and all are ultimately accountable to him, as Peter declares. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. 1 Peter 4:5. So denying this accountability will not change the reality of it or make it go away. I get a laugh when I see these, these Hollywood movies or TV shows, and, they say, oh, I don't believe in that. Like not believing in something makes it go away. Oh, I don't believe in gravity. Well, if you step off the building, you realize it doesn't really matter what you believe in, because believing in something does not change it. The goal is for our beliefs to match with ultimate reality, to absolute truth. Truth is correlated to the facts, so we want to align our minds to that That's the goal. The goal isn't to just say, well, I don't believe in that, so that's just not true or not true for me. That's ridiculous. That's crazy. So finally, the Bible has always claimed the reality of what atheists have always attempted to dispute, which is why they are called fools, right? The fool has said in his heart there is no God. That's from Psalm 14:1. Now, please, I am not saying that atheists, and nor is the Bible saying that atheists are stupid. They're called fools not because they're stupid, quite the contrary, but because they live as if their creator does not exist. This is a folly, and as we have shown, entirely self-defeating. Atheists work very hard to reason God away, trying to silence their conscience by using the very thinking capacity God gave them to reject him. This is a choice they make, for all humans have the free will to love or hate God. He placed that in them and honors their decision regarding his offer of forgiveness through Jesus Christ. It's a folly. In other words, when we do something foolish, then if I see somebody doing something really foolish, I say, why are you being a fool? Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that they're stupid. It may mean they haven't thought something through. But when the Bible calls somebody a fool or says they're committing folly, then the reason is because they are thinking, and ultimately acting in a way to deny their Creator, deny the existence of God, because then they are not living according to how God has created them. Look, God has given us the manual for life. If you're having a problem with your car and you don't know anything about cars and you say, oh, I guess I ran out of gas. Well, I don't have anything other than some water jugs. Let's see if water works. Well, it's going to wreck your car if you put water in the gas tank. So you have to go by the operator's manual, and the Bible is the operator's manual for life. And people are broken, and Jesus Christ came to heal them, to put their lives back together, and to redeem them from their sin. So that is a universal problem everybody has, that the gospel is very simple, that God loves all of us. There is nobody that God does not love. It doesn't mean he's pleased with all of us. But look, even a Christian can act like a fool, because if a Christian acts as though God doesn't exist, if they start to live their life like that, they fit that category also. So it's not necessarily just a person that is an unbeliever, but a Christian can say in their heart, because of their behavior, that they don't want to deal with God, and they're living like he doesn't exist. And that's also a problem, but for another time. So let's appropriately end with a C.S. Lewis quote, since he's been so good to us throughout this. He says, there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and consistently desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find, those who knock, it is opened. It's always been amazing to me. I've been a pastor for 33 years now. And over the last 33 years, a lot of people that I've talked to that deny God, one of the reasons they deny God is because they say, look, because I want to have a good time now, I want to enjoy my life. Look, obviously, I don't believe that that's true, because I didn't give my life to Jesus Christ until I was 24, and I lived a very bad life prior to that. So I know what it's like to be on the other side of the tracks, and so God made a dramatic change in my own life. Now, I've had, since that time, a much better life than I had prior, and I enjoy life now, where I can't really say I was trying to enjoy it before I knew Jesus, but the enjoyment was not there, the peace was not there, and the change that I wanted to make in certain areas that I couldn't make, he made, because he gave me the power to make them after I came to know him, and he forgave me. But so many people feel as though when you come to Christ, like you all of a sudden hit a wall of limitation, but it's actually freedom, because right now people that are bound in sin are bound in the limitations that they cannot get outside of the sin that controls their lives. And they feel as though they want to have enjoyment now, but if they want peace and joy, like C.S. Lewis mentions here, if they want that continual joy, then obviously eternity is going to be forever, where we're only here for a short amount of time. And giving up what you think is going to be, giving you some kind of pleasure in this life for a short time to have ultimate joy, not only in this life when you make that decision for Christ, but in the life to come. I mean, that's where wisdom comes in. We've been talking about reasoning through everything and thinking and conscience and consciousness and all that. Hey, the best thing that you can do is look at the evidence for the resurrection, and with the reason that God has given you, think through the reality of what actually has happened historically and is verifiable by all the evidence and the documentation that exists. It's a historical reality. And a historical reality, as much as far as eyewitnesses and documents and everything else, which again is a whole nother study, but that can all be verified. The one thing that is subjective is the work that God will do in your own life. All the rest is objective, and we reason from that evidence to realize the reality of God's existence and the resurrection of Christ for life, eternal life, and the forgiveness of sins. Once you make that decision based on the objective evidence, and you, by faith, because of that evidence, step into a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, then the subjective work actually starts to take place, because God will change your life from the inside out and do a work that you will have wished that you had made that decision years ago. So look, I'll end the video with that. Certainly if you want to email me, just send me an email at BibleMadeClear@gmail.com. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. If you've stayed with me this long, we're over an hour. I appreciate it. If you're an atheist and you've stayed with me, I really appreciate it, because that's a long time sitting there, and I realize that, and I appreciate it. So for all of you, until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.